For many of us, the killing of George Floyd, a black man, at the hands of a police officer who was white, represented a reckoning on systemic racism in society and a desire to learn. It also inspired Stephen Dorsey to pen the book Black and White, an intimate multicultural perspective on white advantage and paths to change. He joins me now on the bookshelf. Hello there, Stephen.
Good morning, good afternoon, wherever we are.
Good afternoon, good evening, good night. Yes. Stephen, I mentioned George Floyd in the introduction because his death was really such a watershed moment. But really, reading the book, these are thoughts that you've had for a very long time. Why did it take this to get you to finally write the book?
Well, that's a great question. Well, of course, like everybody, I'm dealing with COVID and, that was one. But really, I've been thinking about my Blackness and talking to my older brother, Chris, about our crazy story from our youth and our experience growing up essentially Black and white in a white society and the different experiences we've had both professionally and personally. And of course, like many, I've been paying attention to the Black Lives Matter movement and all the other movements really that are seeking equality in this country and around the world. We think of Black people, people of color, and Indigenous people in this country. And I've been involved in community leaderships and civics and politics and really for decades now. And, the murder of George Floyd was that, kind of spark for me that really had a tremendous impact and got, all of a sudden I found myself at the center of the story, if you will, in my neighborhood and amongst my white friends. I was, I joke about it, but I was like, the Black Lives Matter hotline for them, right? And they were calling and all for all the good reasons, asking me if I was okay and how I was feeling and what they should be feeling and what they should say and should they put a black box on their social media and so on. So really all of this came together, and I'm a professional communicator and strategist, and I've been writing a lot in the last 10 years specifically, and all of this kind of converge. I'm going, maybe I'm the one that can maybe bridge the divides by telling and communicating what this systemic racism and this global reckoning means, and do it in a personal and also from a perspective of looking at society. And that's what I did.
So when we say white advantage as opposed to white privilege, are they the same? Are they different?
Well, they're the same. Again, I just said I'm a communicator, right? So words matter, right? And in many of the conversations I was just discussing, people, my white friends and white people I knew and community people in my neighborhood were saying, Stephen, like I come from modest means. My family came from nothing, and I'm not privileged. I worked hard and I built this business from the ground up and I bought my house. I go, no, I get it. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about advantage. We're talking about the advantage that you white people have had in this country and in the US simply because you're white. You may be even unconscious that you have these advantages, but they exist. And if you're a person of color, a Black person, an Indigenous person in this country, you know what those disadvantages are simply by the fact of your race and your culture. And so once I explained that and I was able to put some meat on the bones of what that meant, I found people were much less defensive and much more receptive to having deeper conversations.
There's a great passage in the book where you write, to be an ally, you need to understand that not everyone has had the same experience as you and your ancestors. Acknowledging these truths doesn't mean you love your country any less. How do you get that point across to people? Because as you just said, many folks tend to get their back up about this kind of concept.
Of course. Well, I hope it comes across in the book. I think all of us, including myself, we have to actually want to go with purpose towards understanding, right? You have to want to do your own work, right? And so I learned a lot by writing my book, right? And, but the information is there. And a lot of the stuff, obviously, we weren't taught in schools. But if you want to, some people are surprised about residential schools, right? And I'm saying, well, our Indigenous people of this country have been telling us this forever. We haven't really been fully listening properly. So now I guess what I'm saying is we all need to go look at the heritage, the past, the history, and look at the truths of what actually happened. And yes, it may make you uncomfortable, right? Because this is actually what happened. Even it was government mandated, a lot of the stuff that happened in regards to Black people and Indigenous people and others who were discriminated and disadvantaged. And now when they say to people, yeah, you know, Stephen, that's the past or whatever, I said, hold on a second, right? We did this in some universities in this country. You could not go there if you were a Black person in this country until, in some of them, until the 60s. Right? You couldn't be admitted into medical school and become a lawyer. You couldn't buy a house or rent a house in certain neighborhoods, right? This is like, I was born in 1966. Some of this stuff was still going on, was still on the books, right? So, and of course, now we get to today and we're trying to explain to those who may not fully understand what we mean by systemic racism, but these are things you just have to go look at the data, which I put a lot in my book, right? 345 footnotes I have in my book, right? So it's there and you can look at it and learn for yourself that the data shows that there's disadvantages in our systems and institutions, from healthcare to education to the judicial system, policing, and others that still exist. And that is what the Black Lives Matter movement is about. And that's what we're asking, is we need to eliminate these things.
I think a powerful or a significant part of the puzzle here in this country is puncturing that, what you call the mythology on race, how we tend to make a national sport of bragging about how we're so different from Americans, yet as you lay out in the book, we have little to be smug about from our treatment of Black people, Chinese people, the Japanese internment, Komagata Maru, and then, as you just mentioned, residential schools. So there's a lot of eye-opening and a lot of soul searching to do as a nation that we have to do.
Well, that's why, you know, I try to, first of all, as someone who's Black and white, but, you know, people see me as a Black person. And of course, my book really tries to shine a light on anti-Black racism and systemic racism. But I thought to myself, how can I write a book about that without talking about Indigenous people, right? There is no way, right? And I've had my own experience with that, as I share in the book, and my story of my own bias and prejudice as a kid and growing up and going to do my learning, and then having quite an impactful experience with former Chief Fontaine of the Assembly of First Nations in 2008. And so we need to look at our stuff. And like I said, it's time that you know, and this isn't my line, but I love it. It's time that we all get comfortable with being uncomfortable, right? And go look at the truths, right? It doesn't mean you love your country less because you're looking at the warts and the bad things that happen. But if you are not a Black person or person of color or Indigenous person in this country, you need, and you wonder why people are marching and people are upset and people want change quickly and want urgency. If you go do your own learning of the truths and what happened and what continues to go on, then maybe we will all get to a place where we can have more fulsome understanding, and then our conversations will be different, right? We'll be starting from the same place, or close to anyways.
Well, speaking of getting comfortable being uncomfortable, you spend a whole chapter talking about Quebec and Quebec exceptionalism. What made you separate this out from the rest of the country?
Well, I'm from there, right? I grew up French Canadian in the suburbs of Montreal and Longueuil, and I loved Quebec. I loved the music and the comedy and everything that had. It was an amazing place to grow up. It was full of culture. Like today, if you think Quebec has one of the most creative industries in terms of theater and all of those things that make it very unique. And so I love the province. And of course, as a Canadian, I've always thought that Quebec needs to have its place in the country equally. And I think in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, there was the Quiet Revolution that tried to do in many ways what we're asking for today with systemic racism, which is reforms and equity measures to bring people to equality, right? Which I think French Canadian aspired to and achieved, I think, in the 70s. And so when I started writing about systemic racism, of course, there was examples all over Canada, but there was examples in the healthcare system with the Indigenous lady that died there because she was mistreated. There was more examples, and I started writing some more from obviously my lived experience in Quebec. And I had, 2 pages, then 4 pages, then 6 pages. Next thing I called my editor, I said, I think I need to write a whole chapter, because now we have some more even serious stuff like Bill 21, which is a bill that was passed in Quebec that discriminates against, in my opinion, against some religious symbols, and people who, especially Muslim women who wear hijab, cannot work in certain public jobs. And of course, now they're talking about Bill 96, which is further would diminish the rights of English-speaking people to that province. And of course, the premier of the province is, I believe, the only leader of a jurisdiction in North America who does not want to admit that systemic racism exists. So I go through a long separation. It's a big chapter. That chapter was very challenging to write because it's very emotional. I have family there. I have friends. I love Quebec, but I want them to, again, as I say, at the base of it, everyone, you can't be more equal than others, right? And so to aspire to your equality doesn't mean you need to diminish other people's rights. And that's really at the core of the chapter.
Like Animal Farm, some animals are more equal than others, right?
Well, that's what inspired me, that quote, right? It's like, I understand that, like, for example, as we're talking about the Black Lives Matter movement, we need reforms, we want some equity measures, all of which are offered within the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, by the way, for race, religion, language, right? But there's nowhere that it says there that your equality rights will be as a result of passing laws that diminishes other people's rights, right? So, and actually it's kind of interesting, if we bring it to today with the protests in Ottawa, people have a right to protest, and I think that was shown. But what really the irony there is that some of the people asking for freedom were actually limiting the freedoms of people that actually lived in that town, right? So it's quite interesting. So one of their objectives was actually countered by the fact that they were doing exactly what they were asking others not to do to them.
So where do we go from here? The last chapter, you title it "Be Better, Do Better, Live Better Together." How would you say we start doing that?
Well, really, that's at the core of what drove me to write the book, right? So I think on the Be Better, we're talking about, and that includes all of us, including myself, we need to be much more aware. And I think I'm a glass half full kind of guy. So I think we have moved to a greater awareness globally on systemic racism. So I think that's good. From there, I'm hoping that individuals will get to their own place of awakening and go, wow, I didn't know, I didn't understand. How many times have I heard that? I never knew, right? Well, now you know, so think about that, reflect about it, have your conversations. And then we all need to do something, right? Do something, little things, big steps. That's where the do better comes in, right? And I detail in my book different ways that people who have different means or abilities or capacity to contribute. And that's going to take a lot of work. And of course, the big lift will be the reforms, right? Where we all come together to look at all the systems, build them apart, take them apart, put them back together so that they're more equal. And if we do that, maybe hopefully as quickly as possible, and within a generation, we should hopefully get to a place where we do live better together in a society that's more equal and just for all Canadians.
All right. The name of the book is Black and White, an intimate multicultural perspective on white advantage and paths to change. It's available from Nimbus Publishing. My thanks to author Stephen Dorsey.
Thank you.